Welcome, welcome. And we'll start, of course, with our bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Thank you. And we are going to go into screen sharing.
Amen.
And we are in Parsha Sh'mini. That's, of course, right up here, Sh'mini. And Sh'mini means the eighth. And that's because when we started, we had left off last week in the Parsha about 7 days of preparation for the installation of Aaron and his sons into the priesthood. And what happened was, they had to do this for 7 days, and this is the 8th day. And on those 7 days, I realized as I was studying it that Moses acted as the high priest in those 7 days. But in this 8th day, now Aaron becomes the high priest. If you're not muted, could you check and make sure you're muted, please? So, okay. So that's the first part. We have moved on because the second part of this Torah portion deals with the laws of Kashrut, the basic laws of what is permissible and what is not permissible for a child of Israel to eat, and what foods one can choose in terms of the animal world. Okay, what animals we are able to eat or not. And we are in the middle of, basically, we're talking about livestock of some kind here. And we're told there's a famous, of course, that many, many people know. We will see that one is not allowed to eat pig. That is one of the things. So, something that occurred to me, the question of why are these two parshiot, part of one parsha? And I think that from a literary standpoint now, it is saying that the decision on the part of a person to follow this mitzvah as to what foods are appropriate and what foods are not appropriate to be consumed, if we are saying that the model of the sanctuary is the model of the human being, just as certain foods were permitted on the altar and other foods were not permitted on the altar, likewise, there's certain, and the altar, let me go one step further, and that the altar, it represents one's digestive system, where the food gets processed. Likewise, this food, our own personal altar, there's certain foods that are permissible and other foods that are not permissible. And so that putting this all together, means that keeping kosher is tantamount to the installation of Aaron and his sons into the priesthood, the whole process of being able to draw close to God in this particular way. So that would be a reason for these two parshiot, or these two ideas, these two apparently disparate commandments or themes to be in the same parsha. So here we go. We are going to see, just if I'm going to go back a little bit because we're catching this right in the middle. Okay. So he says, right, kol mafreset parsa, anything with a split hoof, any animal with a split hoof of a behema, right? V'shosat shesa. And again, that means also essentially has split hoofs, right? Ma'alat gera, who chews the cud, babhema, in cattle, amongst cattle, ota tochelu, that you may eat. Now, goes on to say, ach et zeh, but this lo tochelu, you shall not eat, to make it clear that by split hoof and chew the cud, the and is the logical and, meaning both statements have to be true. Mima'aleh hagaira, from animals that chew the cud, umimafrisei, and who hafarsa, okay? So here what it's saying, okay? In other words, here it means either they chew the cud or they have split hoofs. In other words, one of those is true. Et hagamal, you shall not eat, is what it's saying. Et hagamal, and now it gives examples. The camel, kima alege rahu, for it chews the cud. Ufarsa enona mafris, but it does not have split hoofs. Tamehu lachem, it shall be considered impure for you. So, in other words, there is this again linking the sanctuary, what goes on in the sanctuary, as far as its purpose in bringing the divine into the world, right? Having that ability to bring the divine level of existence into this world. And tameh means something we have to stay away from. And so this, it shall be impure to you. Just like the issues of purity and impurity are hugely important when it comes to the temple. Going on, the Et Hashafan and the Hyrax is how they're translating this. It is difficult, you have to understand, that when they talk about names of animals, specific names of the animals in the Bible, translations, one has to depend on outside sources such as the Talmud, etc., to be able to actually define the animal. So apparently, according to some say it's, I think, the daemon or something like that, but the rock badger, kima alege rahu, because it chews the cud, ufarsa lo yafris, but it again does not have split hoofs. Let me finish this because this is problematic. Tamehu lachem ve'et ha'arnevet. This is like the hare, the rabbit. Ki ma'alat gerahi, because it chews the cud. Ufarsa lohi frisa, but it doesn't have a split hoof. Tume'ahi lachem, you shall consider it impure. It shall be impure to you. Now, of course, hyraxes, rock badgers, rabbits do not chew the cud. And here is the Torah saying it chews the cud, right? And ma'alat ra has to do with the process of rumination. However, I did discover, interestingly enough, there are two issues going on. And I can say this, at least this is what it said about rabbits. Believe it or not, although rabbits do not chew the cud, because, of course, gaining nutrients from grass and things like that is not that easy, apparently the rabbits will defecate, and the feces, that feces is a soft sort of feces, and they eat that and so that it's part of the process of digestion. So that's one possibility, that they're talking about re-eating their food. So that it doesn't necessarily refer to the kinds of stomachs that that cattle have, all right, or deer for that matter. But the process of re-eating the food. With regards to rock badgers, etc., my understanding is they do a lot of chewing, as rabbits do. There's this in their mouths when they eat the food, they do chew a lot. And that, of course, is part of what happens when the animal chews the cud, that genuinely chews the cud, is that it goes into one stomach first, and then it gets taken back into the mouth where it is chewed, rechewed, and then sent to the other. I think there are actually 4 stomachs, correct me if I'm wrong, which are involved in that process. So possibly because of that act of chewing, etc., that possibly that is what is understood here. But with the rabbits, at least I can understand clearer the idea of re-eating the food. And with regards to the shafan, maybe they're also referring to another animal that has that practice. So, and now on to the famous one, the et hachazir, and the pig. Ki mafris parsahu, because it does have split hoofs. The shosa shesa parsa, in fact, they are totally split, properly split. Vahu, but the animal itself, Geira lo yigar, it does not chew the cud, tamehu lachem, it shall be considered impure. Now, why? I mean, we see that there are other animals that are just as impure as the pig, but why is the pig singled out on some levels on the popular, sort of in the popular imagination? Let's call it that. And the reason is because you don't, the the symbolic reference of the pig is that the pig shows split hoofs, but internally doesn't chew the cud. So that in some ways a pig is representative of a hypocrite, that is, who is outwardly pious, but inwardly isn't. It's just the reverse. And that is possibly a reason as to why the pig is singled out the way it is. If there are any comments, please feel free, of course, to comment. So going on.
Yeah, I have a comment, but I
Sure.
tried to raise my hand and I couldn't get
I'm
it to
sorry.
work.
That's okay.
Um, it's just that I think I heard this, but it made sense to me that another thing about the pig is that it was very popular for other people to
Yeah.
eat pig,
Uh-huh.
and to be a big part of people's diet, more so than, and possibly their celebratory diets, but more so than rabbits, and that it was very unusual not to eat pig.
Yeah. Quite
That was, more of a separating
right.
element of Jews
Interesting.
and Gentiles.
Okay, I'd never heard that, so thank you. I appreciate that. I'm trying to sort of uh, process it another way, and that is, I think we've probably talked about this in previous sessions. The whole idea of keeping kosher, uh, because of course, it is not something that is necessarily maintained by liberal Jews. And the whole notion in this case of even if it is simply an arbitrary commandment on the part of Hashem, right? That there are commandments which are, as we know, are called chukim, right? Which are simply arbitrary commandments, and where the whole notion of allowing ourselves to be governed, to accept the notion of mitzvot, so that the idea of a mitzvah is far more significant than simply a good deed, as important as good deeds are. The whole notion of being willing to be disciplined by God and allowing God to make those judgments for oneself and taking that on. I would say something else. I think that, and this isn't limited to Judaism, I think there is a recognition amongst many religions the need to learn how to control one's appetites. And that since both food involves appetite and sexual activity involves satisfying an appetite, that the idea of learning how to discipline oneself in terms of how important that is to a society and certainly to the individual is something that's very fundamental to a good number of religions. And that's part of what's going on here. The ability for us not to be controlled by our appetites, that this is a different kind of coming out of Egypt, because it's so easy for one's appetites to become something that one is addicted to, and to try and free people from addictions. Of course, there's a lot more to it than what I'm touching right now, but basically the principles are out there and it's not just arbitrary.
Well,
Yes,
you also had told us that the concept of holiness and sanctification was related to separation, and not eating bacon is a lot more separating than giving money to the poor.
right, for sure, for sure. And the whole notion of the word kadosh, holy, has to do with being distinct. And of course, we can take that all the way back to what I personally believe is perhaps the most important part of becoming a human being and recognizing how great it is to be a human being. And that is a sense of significance. And these kinds of practices tend to help underscore a sense of significance and just the idea of allowing oneself to know that you are being commanded by a universal, the support of the universe is something that can help you feel significant. And so often, people who become addicted or who get into antisocial behavior or self destructive behavior very often feel extremely insignificant, that no one cares about them, and that they are just, the waste of society, and they feel that way. And not feeling that way is so terribly important, because when you feel that way, in a sense, it gives you permission to hurt yourself and to do things to hurt yourself and to hurt others, because you feel like nothing. And you've heard me say this before, which is that more bad behavior, if we want to just describe it that way, comes about because people don't appreciate themselves sufficiently, don't think enough of themselves in a positive way. We are going to go on to the next little part. So this is interesting, because you'll see that there's quite a long Rashi here, and the deduction. This is based on Talmudic reasoning. You'll see, and the results are really interesting. And it took me a while to get what Rashi was saying and what the argument that the Talmud is presenting. So, Mibsaram lo tochelu, you shall not eat of their meat, right, of the meat. Uvenivlatam lo tigau, nor should you touch their carcasses. Tmeim heim lachem, they shall be impure to you. Okay, so ignore what's written here for the time being, and let's see what it says. Right. So notice they're looking at this in a very legalistic kind of way. Mibsaran lo tochelu. You shall not eat of their flesh. Now, the last thing we read were these particular animals, right? These specific animals. And it's saying of their flesh you should not eat. And so Ein li ella elu. So we might simply infer that it's referring just to these particular animals that it mentions. She'ar behema tame'ah, right? What about the remaining cattle or animals that are impure? She'ein la shum siman tahara. So remember, the examples they gave us, okay, were either this or that, right? In other words, either it doesn't chew the cud or it doesn't have split hoof. And we're now saying, well, what about the rest of the animals that don't have shum siman tahara, that don't have any sign of impurity? They weren't forbidden, right? Didn't say they were forbidden. So here we go, right? Min ein, okay? So how do we know they're also forbidden? And now, I mean, because we already know on a one level, this particular sentence seems unnecessary, okay? So we say kal vachomer. So we use a logical argument that from which we derive more Torah law. In other words, even though it isn't stated explicitly in the Torah, we can consider it a Torah law. Uma elu, the argument goes like this. These animals that are mentioned, sheyesh bahem ktsat simanei Torah, that have a little bit of a sign of purity, asurot, they are forbidden, etc. In other words, all the more so if if it has no signs of purity. So if the animals that have a little bit of a sign of purity are forbidden, then for sure all animals that have no sign of purity are forbidden. And he says, Kol ha'inyan v'Torat Kohanim. And this is the original source from which this is derived. And Torat Kohanim is a midrash, that's a halachic midrash. In other words, an interpretation of the law of Leviticus, Torat Kohanim. Mibsaram. Now, looking at this word, from their flesh. In other words, the meat. Al-basaram, regarding their flesh, the ashara, that is forbidden. Velo al atzmot vegidin. It does not forbid, it just forbids the flesh. It states the flesh regarding the bones or the sinews, the karnaim or the horns, utlafim or the hooves. That is not under this prohibition. And by the way, there are certain issues then that have significance, for example, in creating gelatin. Okay. So that's B'saram. The B'saram you shall not eat, is how we're reading this. Uveniblatam lo tiga'u, nor shall you touch their carcasses. Now, in other words, a nevela essentially is an animal that has died by itself of old age or disease or something like that. A trefa is an animal that is literally, it means torn, and it means an animal that's been killed by another animal. That's the distinction. So here goes. Yachol Yehi Yisrael Muzharim. We could infer from this, right? It's possible to infer that every Jew is warned al maga nevela, that about touching the nevela, that this applies to all Jews, and certainly, just looking at the sentence, it certainly seems to suggest that. Talmud Lomar, okay, and for this reason, Scripture teaches elsewhere, ahead in Leviticus 21, Emor El HaKohanim, and this Emor El HaKohanim from Parshat, it's called Emor, is the Parsha that tells Kohanim that essentially they are not allowed to defile themselves by means of a corpse, a human body, that they are forbidden to go in and touch a human body and be in the presence of a human body. In fact, we read some of the laws regarding this last Shabbat. Okay, not from Vayikra, but from Numbers. But regardless, it is to the Kohanim that are forbidden to, for example, go into a cemetery, etc., except for certain specific relatives, for a mother, a father, a spouse, a wife, a daughter, or a son. They can mourn for them. Okay, so now listen to the argument. Kohanim muzharim. So regarding coming into contact with a human corpse, Kohanim, priests, are forbidden. The Ein Yisrael muzarim, but a regular Israelite is not forbidden to come in contact with a corpse. Kal vachomer. Again, we can apply what is called a kal vachomer. In logic, it's called an a fortiori argument. Here we go. Me'ata, right, from this. Uma tumat. If in the case of the impurity of a corpse, chamura, which is far more serious than the tuma of the impurity of a nevela, of an animal body, nevela, if regarding the impurity of a corpse, lo he's here ba ela kohanim, only priests are forbidden to this kind of impurity. Tumat nevela kala, well, when it comes to nevela, which is far less stringent than the impurity that is contacted through a corpse, lo kol shekain. Wouldn't you say, how much the more so? In other words, right, that if an Israelite is not forbidden to touch a corpse, and only a Kohen is forbidden, then for sure, when it comes to Nevela, Kohanim may not be allowed to touch a Nevela, but certainly if Israelites are allowed to touch a corpse, come in contact with a corpse, they certainly should be able to come in contact with a Nevela. And in fact, that is how we understand this particular law. But it leaves a burning question. Uma Talmud Loma Lo Tig'u. So why does the Torah here say you shall not touch it? And the answer is Barego. That is, on a holiday, on a pilgrim festival, that is when you are not supposed to touch it. Part of the reason is that you may be going up to Jerusalem and offering up and involved in eating offerings. But regardless, that's where this law applies. It's limited to a one of the pilgrim festivals. And this is from Rosh Hashanah Yud Zayin, and I'm going to just finish this off. V'zeh she'amru, and this is in fact suggested, if not stated explicitly, chayav, oh, this is not in the Torah, right? This is in rabbinic writings, probably in the Talmud. Adam barekel. It is incumbent on a person to purify themselves at a pilgrimage festival. And that's where we will leave it for today. Any comments? Yes.
Yeah. Regarding the not eating of gelatin made from pig's hooves,
Yes.
is because I mean, uh, and can you, I mean, so it's hard to formulate the question because it's going in two ways. One
Okay.
is like, can you use pig skin and pig this and pig that? And if not, why not the pig hooves? But
Right.
the other thing is, does it have to do with just eating it? And is it because it wasn't killed properly, so the whole thing becomes not kosher for digestion? Or is it a fence,
Yes,
because it's
exactly.
a pig? I mean, why can't you eat pig hoof gelatin,
I
which is the normal, like marshmallow, for instance?
Yes. So it's obviously this is a question that requires expertise that is beyond my pay grade, but I would say that in general it also applies to animals that were not properly slaughtered, okay? In which case I would have to say that it's possible that it is rabbinic. It is what you said to when you said a fence around the Torah, that while it is not forbidden by the Torah explicitly, it is considered the fact that we don't eat these things is considered a way to prevent us from winding up violating the Torah prohibition, right? So that is a possibility. I mean, I'd like to say it with certainty, but I can't. But it sounds very much like it. Having said that, there is actually a halachic dispute as to whether or not gelatin made from animals that are not kosher slaughtered, perhaps beyond that, okay, but certainly who are not that are not kosher slaughtered is permissible. And that is for another reason. So we have this reason that we just got, but there's another reason for not applying the siag, the fence argument, which is that in processing these hoofs and in processing these parts, the bones possibly too, is that it basically you break down the what these are. You're not eating a hoof. You're eating something that's processed out and it involves possibly, I don't know the exact process itself in extracting gelatin from it, but the question then becomes, is it even considered a food? Right? By the time it's gone through these chemical processes, do you really consider it a food anymore? And the laws of kashrut apply to food. And of course, whether bones or hoofs are considered food, well, the marrow can be very tasty. And I believe there's something called pacha, which is made out of calves' hoofs, all right? And that is a food. But at any rate, there is this particular dispute as to whether gelatin from these animals is permissible. So
So possibly it may be possible for me to eat regular marshmallows as opposed to kosher or vegan marshmallows,
it's possible.
textured marshmallows.
It's possible. I I would want to do more research before I dove into that, right? So yeah.
I
You're
love
just going to have
chocolate
to ask God one of these years,
Well,
It's like,
or a rabbi who's knowledgeable. Alex, you have a question.
Yeah, I'm always the history buff. Uh, so, if barbarians from the north bring their pigs to the river valleys, and we know how pigs act. They tear everything up while they're at it. I mean, they're just not allowed down there. They must have been hated. I mean, even Arabs don't eat pigs generally. So, uh, That's the simplest thing about how bad pigs are. And man, they are dirty. They lay around in mud. But I imagine if you had your grains in your river valleys and the barbarians brought these things down, it was bad.
Yes. Well, it's a sideline. I think that you know, in Muslim law, one is not permitted, a Muslim is not allowed to eat pig. Whether, okay, are do the laws, we're going to get into laws of what fish are permissible and what fish are prohibited. I don't believe that necessarily applies in Islam. I don't know for absolute certain, but you know, I haven't ever
I
heard.
think they eat shellfish.
Yeah, I think they do. I think they do.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right. So I'm going to stop the recording and thank you all for participating.